Hey everybody, it's Miss Saxton, and today I thought I'd start reading a chapter book with you. I'm going to read to you Survival Tales, The Titanic. I've always been really obsessed with the Titanic, so I thought I'd share my obsession with you. This is about some of the pets that were actually on board. It's a fictional story, so it's not true, but it is from the point of view of the different pets that were on the Titanic. So we start on Tuesday, April 9th, 1912, and this chapter is from Mutt's point of view. The rain fell softly, swirling around the small garden to land on Mutt's weary, dull brown fur. It was the kind of rain that seemed barely there at all when you looked out from the dry comfort of indoors, little more than a mist on the wind. But when you had no choice but to be out in it, it almost was as wet as a full pelt downpour. Mutt looked around the garden for some kind of shelter. There was a small vegetable patch with sprouting potato plants, carrots, and radishes, and a wooden outhouse, and leaned against the back of the house, but the master kept that locked. Mutt sneezed, covering his head with his paws, but the rain continued to drip, drip, drip into his eyes, no matter what he did. Mutt hated getting wet. He hated being in trouble even more, though. The master had caught him earlier that day trying to dig up some radishes, and after a loud telling off, he tied Mutt to the rickety garden fence. The master was a fisherman by trade and knew how to tie an unyielding knot better than anyone. Mutt tried once more to wriggle his way free from the old fraying rope, which smelled like seaweed and markle. But despite his tugging, the knot was held fast. Now the sky was darkening. His teeth were sore and his neck throbbed with a painful heat beneath the rope. The worst part of all was that if the master was angry with Mutt, he would be angry with Alice too. Mutt was going nowhere. His stomach growled and he let out a small whine to get the master's attention, in case he had forgotten that Mutt was there. Inside the house, Mutt was looming shadow of the master, lit by dim, flickering lamplight, but nobody came to the door. Mutt caught the scent of something rich and delicious, and his stomach growled again. He imagined that they might have lit the fire. The night was cold enough for it, and even though it was early April and the flowers were sprouting up all over the village, it was still very cold. Finally, the rain eased off, and the back door slammed open, suddenly followed by a booming yell. "Alice!" Alice ran outside, bright red hair streaking behind her as her bare feet slapped across the wet mud. She threw herself down beside Mutt and buried her face in his fur, not caring that it was filthy and stinky and wet. He nuzzled into her neck, feeling all the warmer for having her close by. There was no better feeling on earth, Mutt thought, than being with his girl. He sniffed and licked Alice's hands to see if she'd brought him anything to eat, but they were empty. "Alice, get back here now!" the master roared from the doorway. Mutt froze, his ears flattening against his head and his tail dropping between his legs as he shrank backward. Alice clung to Mutt tighter than the rope around his neck. "I won't leave him," Alice wailed, pulling Mutt closer. The master gave a loud grunt and yanked on his boots, then sloshed toward them. Mutt chanced a quick glance, but instead of finding the usual wrinkled brow and scowl, he saw the master seem almost sad. "Alice," the master said again, his gruff voice quieter, "we can't take him with us." "Why not?" Alice asked, the sound muffled by Mutt's overgrown fur. "Because we can't. Dogs aren't allowed on the big steamers," the master replied, crouching beside Alice. Mutt's ears pricked up. Alice had been out fishing plenty of times on the master's lugger, but never on a steamer. The steamers were the biggest of all the ships, like entire floating villages. Mutt cocked his head to one side, an uneasy feeling growing in his stomach that had nothing to do with his hunger. Humans only went on a steamer when they were going somewhere far, far away. The master put his large, calloused hands on Alice's shoulder, but she shrugged him off. "Other people take their dogs on boats," she cried, wiping the tears across her face with her nightdress's sleeve. Mutt licked at her tears, but the master gave him a sharp look, and he slunk back again. "Mary Parker told me so," Alice continued. "Her cousin Alfie works down at the shipyard. He's seen plenty of people take animals on the big ships. Not just dogs either, chickens, pigs, even big colorful birds in wired cages." The master rubbed a hand over his face and sighed. Not people like us, though. He pulled a folded piece of paper out of his jacket pocket and opened it to show Alice. In the darkness, it was too difficult to read the writing printed on it, but Mutt could just about make out a small design at the top of the paper, a red flag with a white star in the middle. We're in steerage, the master said, 3rd class. We're lucky they even let poor people like us on fine ship like this, let alone an old Mutt. He jerked his head toward Mutt and let out a small huff of a laugh. Besides, he's too chicken-hearted to set foot on any old lugger, let alone the biggest ship in the world. Mutt gave a gruff bark in protest, but the master ignored him. It's not his fault he doesn't like water, Alice said, kissing Mutt's head in sympathy. She glanced at the paper in her father's hand, curiosity getting the better of her. It is really the biggest ship in the world? The master nodded. Just think of it, Alice. It'll be a new life for us, a new world, and we'll be traveling there on the most luxurious ship that was ever built. Alice leaned forward to get a closer look. The Titanic? She whispered. Mutt whined as she pulled away from him. He yanked at the rope, but it tightened around his throat with each tug. When it became almost too tight to bear, he changed tactic, scratching and digging at the ground to loosen up the fence post. He wouldn't let Alice leave without him. He couldn't. Mutt, you'll hurt yourself, Alice cried, loosening the rope slightly and stroking his head. She scratched him in his favorite spot beneath his chin, and he calmed a little. Of course, she wouldn't let the master leave him behind. She would find a way to persuade her father. She always did. After all, Mutt belonged to Alice. Alice belonged to Mutt. It was the way it had always been. He knows something's wrong, Alice told her father, her eyes beginning to tear again. Can't we at least bring him inside? His fur is soaked through. The master glanced at Mutt and paused. It's best if he stays out here for now. Alice rested her face against Mutt's and licked at her cheek. It tasted like sea salt and blackberries. But he's my best friend, Alice said quietly. Mom would have let me. If the master heard, he had no reply. The 3 of them sat silently, surrounded by the familiar sounds of distant gulls and the echo of foghorns. Your mom would have wanted us to take this opportunity, the master said finally. Now come along inside. You'll catch a chill. Who will look after Mutt? Alice asked. Peter Craggs is coming by in the morning to collect him, the master said. It's all been arranged. Peter Craggs! Alice shrieked. Mutt hates Peter Craggs. Peter Craggs hates Mutt. He told me so himself. Mutt growled in agreement. Peter Craggs smelled worse than fish guts on a hot day. The boy had thrown pebbles at him and Alice last week when they were scavenging along the beach. She and Mutt had chased the boy all the way back to the village. The master huffed. No one else will take him, Alice. He's not the best behaved dog. Oh, Papa, please, Alice begged. Mutt is family. We could hide him in our trunk, or we could stay here. I don't want to go to the New World. Let's stay here, please, Papa. They'd throw Mutt overboard if they discovered him, and then they'd send us right back home. The master shook his head. The ship leaves tomorrow at noon, and we're going to be on it. Alice pulled Mutt closer than ever, crying huge, wrenching sobs that vibrated through Mutt's entire body. Mutt yelled, his own lament rising above Alice's until he couldn't hear her crying anymore. It grew louder still when the master yelled at him to shut up before an old Mrs. Walton came knocking. But before Mutt yelled loudest of all, when the master pulled Alice away and dragged her inside the house, bolting the door, leaving Mutt tied to the rickety fence alone in the cold, wet garden. What do you guys think? Do you think that Mutt will end up on the ship with them? Stay tuned for chapter 2.